The dollar is running out of time. Here's the paradox nobody explains clearly. The US dollar looks stronger than ever on screens, in markets, in headlines, yet by the same historical map that killed every global reserve currency before it, the dollar is now entering the most dangerous phase of its life. Not a theory, not a forecast, a pattern that has already played out again and again. And this matters to you for one simple reason. When reserve currencies fail, they don't fail politely. Prices jump, savings shrink, paychecks lag. What you could afford last year suddenly feels out of reach, even though nothing about your effort changed. This isn't about politics, it's about timing. The dollar became the world's anchor in the mid-20th century. Every anchor before it snapped after roughly the same lifespan. No exceptions. The system always looks stable right before confidence breaks. But here's the part nobody says out loud. Once this phase begins, history shows there is no controlled landing, no smooth adjustment, only acceleration, and the most important signal isn't what leaders are saying, it's what they're doing. What actually triggered this conversation wasn't a single crisis, it was a convergence, debt levels expanding faster than growth, money creation replacing production, and a global system quietly shifting its behavior while public language stayed calm. Here's what we know. The US dollar didn't become dominant by accident. It became central because the world agreed to treat it as neutral, reliable, and scarce enough to trust. Over time, that trust allowed the US to run permanent trade deficits without immediate consequences. Goods flowed in, paper flowed out. The arrangement worked because everyone believed the paper would hold value tomorrow. But now notice the pattern forming. The system is no longer absorbing stress. It's recycling it. Deficits don't correct, they compound. Debt doesn't shrink, it rolls forward. And instead of tightening, the response has been expansion at scale. This is where the story flips, because the issue isn't whether the dollar is collapsing today, it's whether the mechanisms that once stabilized it are still functioning at all. Ask yourself this: if the foundation hasn't changed, why does every emergency require more intervention than the last? And what happens when intervention becomes the system itself? The strongest claim in the source material is this: the system didn't drift into danger, it was designed into it. Once the dollar became the world's reserve currency, it inherited a hidden requirement. To supply the world with dollars, the US had to send more dollars out than it brought back in. That meant permanent trade deficits, permanent borrowing, permanent imbalance. This isn't opinion, it's structural. Here's the concrete detail that makes this real. After the early 1970s, the dollar was no longer tied to gold. From that moment on, the US could issue currency without a physical constraint. Printing replaced production as the stabilizer. And at first it worked. The world accepted dollars in exchange for real goods, energy, labor, and resources. But notice what's missing from the official story. There was never a plan for how this ends. The system assumes infinite confidence. It assumes foreign buyers will always recycle their surplus back into US debt. It assumes demand for paper will forever match the supply of promises. That's the gamble. This is where the tension tightens. Because once confidence weakens even slightly, the same mechanism that created stability starts producing instability at speed. And here's the part most people overlook. When a system depends on belief, belief doesn't fade linearly. It breaks suddenly. Now watch how fast this escalates. Once instability starts, it doesn't announce itself with alarms, it normalizes. At first, the responses feel reasonable. More liquidity, emergency measures, temporary fixes, each one justified as necessary, each one framed as responsible. But stacked together, they begin to change the system itself. What used to be extraordinary becomes routine. This has happened before, not in theory, but in practice. When past empires reached this stage, They didn't collapse the moment their currency weakened. They stretched it. They leaned harder on debt. They shifted from making things to managing paper. And for a while it looked like resilience. But here's where the comparison gets uncomfortable. In every case, the later phase wasn't marked by recovery. It was marked by escalation. More borrowing to cover old borrowing. More promises to defend old promises. And a growing gap between what the currency represented and what it could actually command. This is the normalization that matters. Printing money stops being a crisis response and becomes a baseline policy. Deficits stop being warnings and become expectations. The system survives, but only by consuming more of its future each year. Here's why that detail changes everything. Once normalization sets in, reversal becomes politically and mathematically impossible. And that's when pressure stops building quietly. It starts leaking out sideways. The next layer is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Publicly, stability is the message, confidence, control, careful management, but the actions tell a different story. When debt grows faster than the economy that supports it, servicing that debt becomes the real priority. Not growth, not productivity, survival. Here's the concrete shift. Interest costs begin to rival core national spending. Monetary authorities step in, not to guide markets, but to absorb risk that no one else wants. Bonds that should find buyers at higher yields instead find a backstop, not because it's efficient, but because there's no alternative that doesn't trigger a chain reaction. Notice what's missing from the reassurance. There's no discussion of how this unwinds without pain. No explanation for how confidence is restored without sacrifice. The language stays optimistic while the balance sheet tells the truth. This is where the story permanently changes. Because when the system's stability depends on intervention, intervention stops being a tool and becomes the load-bearing wall. Remove it and everything shakes. Increase it and the structure weakens anyway. But here's the detail that reframes the entire issue. The goal is no longer to fix the imbalance. It's to delay the recognition of it. And once delay becomes policy, time stops being an ally. It becomes the enemy. Then the pressure starts stacking faster than anyone can manage. One development doesn't cause panic. Two still feel manageable. But when they arrive together, the system loses its margin for error. Debt rolls over at higher costs, currency creation accelerates to keep markets calm, and foreign participation, once taken for granted, becomes conditional. This is where control begins to slip, not through collapse, but through speed. Decisions that used to take years now happen in weeks. Measures described as temporary stretch forward with no clear endpoint. Each move narrows the available options for the next one. Notice how quickly the tone changes. The conversation shifts from long-term planning to damage control, from prevention to containment, from confidence to urgency. That transition matters more than any single headline. And here's the uncomfortable stacking effect. The more the system intervenes to maintain stability, the more fragile it becomes if intervention ever slows. Markets learn to depend. Governments learn to defer. Risk concentrates instead of dispersing. This is the mini crisis most people miss because it doesn't look dramatic. There's no single crash, just mounting pressure and shrinking room to maneuver. So ask the only question that matters now: what happens if this continues? Now shift the lens away from institutions and onto you. Because systems don't break in balance sheets first. They break in daily life. The early signs aren't abstract. They show up at the grocery store, at the gas pump, in rent notices, and in the gap between effort and outcome. You work the same hours, you make the same decisions, but somehow less stretches further. This is how currency stress becomes personal. Prices respond faster than wages. Savings lose quiet ground even when the number in your account doesn't change. Planning becomes harder because the future stops feeling predictable. Not catastrophic, just unstable. Notice how ideology disappears at this level. It doesn't matter who you voted for when your costs rise faster than your income. It doesn't matter what the market did today if your monthly expenses quietly reset upward. This is where frustration turns into something heavier. People don't feel poorer overnight, they feel stuck. And when enough people feel stuck at the same time, behavior changes. Spending shifts, trust erodes, risk tolerance spikes. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because what you're experiencing isn't individual failure, it's systemic pressure leaking into everyday life. And once it reaches this layer, it doesn't go back quietly. To understand why this keeps happening, you have to look past personalities and headlines and focus on the mechanism. Modern power doesn't rely on force first, it relies on leverage. Control the unit of account, and you influence trade, debt, markets, and behavior without firing a shot. That leverage works as long as participation feels voluntary and beneficial. The moment it feels extractive, participants start looking for exits. Here's the unsettling insight. Systems like this don't collapse because people stop believing in them. They collapse because people are given incentives to hedge against them. Small shifts, quiet adjustments, alternatives that don't announce themselves as revolutions. Fear plays a role, but spectacle matters just as much. Crises justify extraordinary measures, complexity discourages scrutiny, and speed prevents coordination. By the time most people notice the pattern, it already feels normal. This is why outrage rarely fixes anything. The system isn't broken in one place. It's optimized to survive by transferring pressure outward and downward. Losses are socialized, gains are protected, stability is preserved by spreading instability. Here's the part that should linger. Power doesn't disappear when a system weakens. It migrates, and when it does, the rules don't change all at once. They change just enough that you realize too late you're playing a different game. From here, the path forward splits, and neither option is clean. One direction looks orderly on the surface. Gradual adjustments, new frameworks, quiet diversification away from dependence without calling it a break. In this path, nothing dramatic happens all at once. Confidence erodes slowly, replaced by parallel systems running beside the old one. Trade settles in different units. Reserves shift quietly. Power diffuses without a single announcement. The other direction is faster and messier. A shock forces recognition. A market event, a conflict, or a policy mistake exposes how little room is left. Confidence doesn't fade. It gaps. And once that happens, responses become reactive instead of strategic. Control narrows to crisis management. Notice the common thread. In both paths, momentum already exists. The decision isn't whether change happens, it's whether it unfolds gradually enough to feel manageable or suddenly enough to feel traumatic. And here's the detail that matters most. Systems don't wait for consensus before moving on. They respond to incentives, pressure, and opportunity. The next phase doesn't need permission. It just needs a trigger. That's why the most important moves aren't happening on camera. They're happening in preparation. And once preparation turns into execution, the direction becomes obvious. Here's the insight that reframes everything you've heard so far. This story isn't really about the dollar. It's about what happens when a system built for dominance collides with its own scale. The very features that made it powerful, reach, flexibility, influence, become liabilities when the environment changes. Strength turns into exposure. Every cycle ends the same way, not because of failure, but because of success pushed too far. The system doesn't break at its weakest point. It breaks at the point of maximum confidence. That's why the warning signs are subtle. Markets still function. Institutions still speak calmly. Daily life still moves forward. But underneath, the assumptions that made everything feel stable are quietly being rewritten. This is where the loop closes. If you understand this phase, You'll recognize it again when it appears in a different form with a different name in a different system. That's the real advantage. Not prediction, but pattern recognition. Because the next story won't start with collapse. It will start with reassurance. And if you want to stay ahead of that moment, if you want to see the signals before they're obvious, follow this channel for continued analysis. The next layer is already forming.